Welcome to the Equine Vet Connect Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Carter. I'm a veterinarian and a farrier. The goal of this podcast is to educate horse people, break things down, bust myths, and keep it real. Speaking of breaking things down, here's my legal disclaimer to keep my attorney and insurance company happy. While I am a vet, I may not be your vet. Contact them before trying anything you hear on this podcast. Remember, just because you watched it on YouTube or heard it on a podcast does not mean you can do it. Please use common sense. Welcome back to the Equine Vet Connect Podcast. We're here at Countryside Equine Hospital. We're back in the old studio, a little treatment room one here. I got Dr. Brown back with me. We got a pretty exciting episode today. We've been getting a lot of requests for this one, so we're going to be talking about genetic diseases. We're going to talk about how the genetics work on these conditions. We're not going to do a deep dive into each condition. We'll touch on it. But, you know, as we're setting up for this episode, one of the things we realized, like each one of these genetic conditions is like a whole episode unto itself.
Oh, yeah.
So we're gonna dig in the genetics behind this because we're kind of moving into breeding season. And a lot of people have questions about genetic testing. Mm-hmm. And so let's kind of dive into this. You know, I think what I'd like to stress is genetic testing is part of responsible breeding. It's not just about color.
Right.
But it's about responsible breeding. You know, when we know better, we can do better. Mm-hmm. And with genetic testing, we definitely know better now.
Yes.
And so let's dive into this and let's start talking about genetics.
Right. So like you kind of mentioned about color, I think when I ask people if their horses ever had any genetic testing, that's the first thing they always think of is, color patterns. And I'm like, yes, that can be a really important thing, in the industry, but there's so much more to genetics that we've learned about. And there's, even going back to color, there are some diseases too that are associated with colors that we've learned.
The lethal white ovaros.
Mm-hmm. That's probably the most common one that we think
Right.
of, and and it's definitely linked to that gene. There's another one too in Appaloosas that's linked to leopard spots, and it causes blindness in these horses.
Right.
So we've kind of started to realize that a lot of these diseases are very complex. So I think that's one of the things in this podcast is we're going to try to break things down as simple as possible, about as simple as genetics can be, because as we'll kind of come to learn through this podcast, genetics is a very, very complicated, and you can go really, really deep with this. And we still don't even really know all of the ins and outs of it.
Well, especially some of these are multifactorial.
Yes.
You can have genes that code for something, but then you have another gene that determines whether that's being expressed or not. And that's been the difficulty in coming up with more and more of these genetic conditions and developing these genetic tests is just because you carry a gene doesn't mean you may necessarily be affected.
Right.
And then you've also got to think about, all right, if I'm breeding, as we'll get into, not only like I may make sure that my horse isn't going to be phenotypic for a condition, maybe not express that gene, but if I'm breeding a carrier, I need to know what that means for the potential offspring for that individual. So
Right.
let's dive into the basics of it. Let's dive into the basics, and when horses reproduce, they get genes from the sire, genes from the dam.
Yes.
And that's where all the variation comes from. And that's basically the root of what we're talking about. So when we breed that foal, we're looking at genes from the sire, genes from the dam, and what that produces.
And that makes up your entire genome. And, what you inherit from both sides is completely different, even, between one offspring to the next. That's why, most of us don't look exactly like our siblings.
True.
So there's a lot of variability within itself. And, with that comes, when we start talking about some of these diseases, we may start talking about, the odds of a individual developing one of these diseases based on, what their parents, genes are carrying and how they pass it down. So kind of getting into, what we're talking about, we're going to break down some of the terminology that you're going to hear us using through this episode. So the first word we're going to talk about is genotype. So genotype, it refers to what combination of genes you have, or alleles. Alleles is basically the word for like the variation of the gene that you have. And so there's kind of two different categories in this. You have homozygous, which means you have two copies of the same gene. And then heterozygous, which means you have one copy of each different type of gene. And so you can be something called homozygous dominant, which means you have an allele that if that allele is present, it is expressed, versus homozygous recessive means you have two that are recessive.
When I think about that, I think about in people, brown eyes.
Yes, that's probably the easiest example that we have of this. So in humans, eye color is determined by one gene. It's about as simple as it gets. So the dominant allele is the brown-eyed gene, and the recessive is the blue-eyed gene. So if you receive two copies of a brown-eyed gene from your parents, your eyes are going to be brown. If you receive two copies of blue-eyed gene, your eyes would be blue. But if you receive one brown gene and one blue gene from either of your parents, your eyes will be brown because the brown gene is the dominant gene.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And of course, I kind of want to segue, and all I can think about is brown-eyed girl right now, which makes sense why there's more brown-eyed girls out there.
Exactly.
It's a dominant trait. So, in that case, you can, for brown eyes, you can either be homozygous for brown eyes, or you can be heterozygous for brown eyes, but you'll still have brown eyes.
Correct.
So you have to be homozygous for blue. Okay. And let's talk about recessive versus dominant. All right, dominant is just what it says. If that gene is present, that is what will happen.
Correct.
It trumps recessive.
Recessive, yes.
So if you have a recessive trait, you have to be heterozygous, or you had to have two copies of that recessive gene.
Correct.
To express that.
So that's kind of your breakdown of just what genotype means when we are talking about that.
So then let's talk about, you can have genotype, which is what your code is. Phenotype is what actually gets expressed.
Yes.
So you have genes for brown eyes, and then the phenotype will be you actually
have the brown eyes. Exactly. So that's like the manifestation of that. And so some of these diseases we're going to talk about are, pretty black and white. It's like you either have it or you don't.
Right.
But then other ones are you have it, but you may have it to a lesser extent if you only have one dominant gene versus if you have two dominant genes.
Correct.
So that's where, this word phenotype comes in that you're going to be hearing.
Yeah, and there's other things we run into. One of them is the codominant.
Codominance, yes.
Yeah.
So just to, let's change it up a little bit. Let's make it a little more complicated. Basically, when we say codominant, it means that you have two different sets of genes that are contributing to that phenotype. And the easiest one to think about in humans is blood type, because you have two different sets of genes that are coding. You have the A gene and you have the B gene. And so if you have the A or the B, those are considered your dominant, and then the O gene is considered your recessive. So that's how you get either blood type A, blood type B, blood type O, or blood type AB.
So the way I think about it is, if I have a parent that has an A gene, and then there's a parent that has a B gene, you'll be AB.
You could, yes.
Both your parents carry the O gene, you're going to be O. In order for you to be A, both parents have to carry the A gene.
Correct.
And so I do think that's probably the most common one that we see in people.
I think it's the most common. It's the simplest to kind of think about, and again, most of the genes that we are talking about are multifactorial, which means there are a lot of different genes at play. There's also environmental factors that can influence this. There's a lot of cool research on, identical twins that are raised apart, and how their genes kind of change over time, the expression of them, which is cool. And that's, I think, one of the cool things about genetics is that we are learning so much about genetics.
Yes.
All the time. Most of the information that you're going to hear on this podcast came from a couple of the genetics labs. UC Davis out in California and the University of Wisconsin are kind of the two main genetics labs that at least I got a lot of my information from. A lot of these diseases we're going to talk about, they have extensive information about it. So, if you want to nerd out with us, you can definitely check those out. They have a lot of good resources, and that's where we actually send a lot of our genetic testing when we are looking into some of these for our patients. And A lot of it's, pretty simple. It just, requires pulling out a couple hairs and sending them off in the mail and waiting a couple weeks and then getting your results.
Yep. It's really kind of cool that we're able to do this, and I feel like the more we learn, the less we know.
Yes.
That's definitely what I've seen with genetic testing is the more we know, the less we know. Because even we look at some of these conditions, like one of the issues we've had figuring out some of the genetic traits is we may find a gene that codes for something. And so we may have a genotype, but we don't have a phenotype. And so now we're learning that we have other genes that control whether or not that gene is expressed or not. And so it becomes this really, really complicated multifactorial
Yes.
process that it takes a long time. And you look at the genetic code, there's a lot of what we call nonsense code in there, which codes for absolutely nothing. And
At
so
least that we know of.
Right, that we know of. And so they call it a nonsense code. And then you have codes or you have genomes that do code for things. And my gut feeling is we're going to find out this nonsense code, that, as we call it, which is we don't think it codes for anything, probably actually codes
Right.
for something.
And what's interesting too is that a lot of these even different variations of the genes, all it is a change in one part of it. So either, a substitution of, another variable in there, or you delete part of it out. It's one teeny tiny little change in there. It's not, like we're, completely scrambling everything. It's just, substitution of one factor, which is
Crazy.
it's crazy that, one little change can create an entirely different, outward appearance.
So to all our listeners out there, this is going to get easier to understand. If you seem confused right now, that's okay, because it can be, as we work through some of these, I think it'll become easier and easier to understand, and understand that even we struggle through some of these conditions as we're trying to learn about them and understand how this works. So let's dive into some of these. We're going to start with quarter horse diseases. I feel like that's probably where the most work has been done.
Yes.
Identifying these, and I think one of the first genetic diseases that was really identified in horses was the HYPP gene, hyperkalemic periodic paralysis.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is where we have an issue with sodium channels. And the easiest way to think about this is sodium lives on the outside of the cell, potassium lives on the inside of the cell. And with this, hyperkalemic means high potassium. The potassium ends up on the wrong side of the cell. You end up with a high amount of potassium on the outside of the cell and more sodium on the inside of the cell, and it leads to a seizure type disorder. These horses tremor, they shake, they get really stiff. It's a really difficult disease if your horse has it. Like, it's a constant management. You're constantly having to be on the watch and be prepared for this one, but it was the first one that we identified.
So this came about, kind of in the quarter horses because they traced it back to one stallion called Impressive. And they found that his progeny were all showing these same signs. And they were able to, go and do some genetic research and figured out that they were all carrying this same gene. And so this disease is something called autosomal dominant, which, if you refer back to our beginning, it means that you just need one copy of the HYPP gene in order to express this. So if you have two copies of the HYPP gene, you're more likely to have more severe symptoms compared to if you just have one and you're heterozygous for it, but you will still show those signs.
So 1H, 1N, you're considered a carrier. Your heterozygous symptoms are less. 2H's, you're going to be very symptomatic, and you're going to have a much more difficult time.
Right.
So you really, and I think quarter horses have now finally started to say, hey, we need to get rid of this. So if you've got 2H's, you're no longer allowed to be registered.
Right, which I think is, really, no pun intended, impressive of the AQHA on, just trying to take control of this situation,
Right.
because, this is a pretty devastating disease. I know we have some patients here that suffer from this. And I mean, I don't think any of those owners would want to go through that again,
No.
of having another horse with this, or having to have another, owner have to go through dealing with this. It's and not to say that these horses can't, still live, a relatively normal life, and, perform and be happy, but it is a lot of work.
It is, and you've got to pay attention to diet. You've got to pay
Yes.
attention to exercise. And I think when you're looking at breeding horses, obviously, if you've got an HH horse, this is not a good horse to breed.
No.
Because even if you have an NN on the other side, because it is autosomal dominant, if you've got a sire that's HH and you've got a dam that's NN, so the sire is homozygous for the gene, the dam is homozygous not having the gene, you're 100% guaranteed that the offspring is going to be HN.
Correct.
100%.
Correct.
You're going to have a symptomatic horse.
And then if you have two horses that are both carriers of this, if they're both heterozygous, then, you playing the odds game, 75% of these offspring could have it, 25% might not, but
Right.
that's still.
And there's a 25% that you're going to produce a homozygous offspring. So,
Right.
and even if you have one that's HN breeding to an NN, there's a 25% chance that your offspring is going to be a carrier of this.
Exactly. And
So.
it's again, this. I think this is one of these things that, I'm glad that the industry, made moves to do this. And I think I think it says a lot. And, I'm hoping that, as we, kind of start to see these other diseases, that we can, make changes with this. And because, I think it's really protected a lot of horses down the line. Because, from my understanding, Impressive was a pretty, rock star horse. Like,
Yes.
everybody wanted their horse
Yes,
to look
in
like
the
him.
halter world, he was the guy.
He was like that guy, yeah. So it was, I mean, his DNA's everywhere.
Yes,
We run into impressive bred horses all the time.
right.
All the time.
So if your horse goes back to impressive and you're looking at breeding, or even if he just goes back to impressive in general, you need to know what the genetic status is. Like, because there's certain things you need to talk to your veterinarian about
Yeah.
and be prepared for. So,
Absolutely.
So let's dive into another one. This is a personal favorite of mine. Everybody knows that I am a neuromuscular nerd. I love neuromuscular conditions. I think, to me, they're just cool. And that is going to be PSSM, polysaccharide storage myopathy. And we're talking about the type 1 variant. And I want to be really clear here. Type 1 is genetic. It's a mutation in the GYS1 gene. We have a type 2 PSSM, and there has not been a genetic cause determined for type 2 PSSM at this time.
At this time.
At this time. Who knows where that's going to go. So let's talk about type 1 PSSM.
So this is another autosomal dominant, which means you just need to have one copy of this gene in order to show the signs of PSSM. Again, if the individual is heterozygous, means they only have one copy of the gene and then one copy of the recessive gene. Their symptoms may be less severe than the ones that are homozygous for this, but they're still going to be showing this.
Correct.
And this, basically the mutation in this GYS1 gene, it basically affects the way that the cells are storing glycogen, which is the energy that these cells use for it. And then when this happens, the muscles just begin to rapidly break down. And these horses look like they're having just repeat tie-up episodes. A lot of them are just having, kind of consistent performance issues that aren't really related to any lameness or ulcers, or we kind of start ruling things out. And then we get a little more, we start to get a little more suspicious of this.
Yeah, these horses cramp up when they're exercised, and they are able to store the glycogen in the muscles. They're just not able to get it back out, which is going to be a little different than what we're going to talk about later, where they don't have the ability to store glycogen. This one, they store glycogen, but they're unable to mobilize that glycogen out of the cells, and it causes these horses to cramp up. And that cramping up can be very severe, where it's full on tying up and they can't walk, or it can be just mild cramping, or our medical term for that's rhabdomyolysis. it causes that mild cramping to where they just don't perform well. And again, and this is important to know too, this is not just a quarter horse condition. We hear
Right.
about it a lot because quarter horses is part of their 5 panel test, but it happens in almost every breed.
Yes, we
This-
have found it in a lot of breeds, which is, kind of goes back to that all of these breeds really kind of trace back to a lot of the same horses to begin with.
Right.
So, some of these diseases, yes, we say, oh, this is a quarter horse disease, but we're like, this disease has probably been around for a very long time and just kind of slowly trickled its way into, all these other breeds. And, maybe on accident we started selecting for some of these over time just because of breeding and what type of horse we wanted for this discipline or that. But that's why they tend to be like, oh, this is just a quarter horse disease, and it's like, no, it's not.
Nope. I've seen it in Arabs, warm bloods, thoroughbreds, saddlebreds. We found this in a lot of different breeds.
Yes.
So just because you don't have a quarter horse does not mean that you cannot have PSSM type 1. So another good one, if you're going to breed, I think this is a very, very good test to run.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I think when let's say you have a mare, I think you need to test your mare. If you're looking to breed to a certain stallion, I think you need to find out, hey, has the stallion been tested? Because especially if, let's say you have a mare that's heterozygous for this, you don't need to go breed to a homozygous stallion.
No.
And also knowing if you're breeding to a heterozygous stallion, again, we go back to the odds of, if you're heterozygous, the stallion's heterozygous, the mare's heterozygous, you got a 25% chance you're going to have a homozygous for PSSM type 1.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really important to know if you have this condition. Like I said, I cannot stress this enough. It is not just, actually, type 2 PSSM is more common in quarter horses than type 1. So need to know.
And I think what's important that we, reiterate too is that this testing is, it's very accessible. It's very accessible. Like, we don't even have to be involved in it.
No.
I mean, any owner can grab some hair out of their horses and put them in the mail and do this testing.
And your biggest thing, if you're going to do that, you want to use, we like to pull hair from the mane. And when you pull that hair, you want to look at it. You need about 20 to 30 of them. And my thought is, like, if 20 or 30 is good, pull 50. Your horse isn't going to know. And you don't have to sit down and count. Just get a few. And you need to make sure you have the little white roots on the end of it. It's not the hair. You can't just clip hair. You've got to have those live roots, those little white roots on the bottom. And then you just send it into the lab. It's incredibly stable. Doesn't have to go on ice. You don't have to chill it. It's not an overnight kind of deal. DNA is really, really stable.
Yes.
You can ship it out.
Right. And it's not relatively expensive,
No.
especially in the world of breeding. It's probably one of the cheaper tests that we run. So
I think this is, to me, type 1 PSSM, if you're going to breed any horse of any breed, you need to be checking for this one. This one's not going back. Obviously, HYPP that we just talked about, if you don't have impressive in the lineage anywhere, I'm not concerned about it. PSSM, if you're a horse, test
it.
So,
Absolutely.
So we'll jump into another quarter horse disease, HERDA, hereditary equine regional dermal can you pronounce that?
Asthenia.
Asthenia. Oh Lord, my Georgia gets in the way sometimes. That's saying some of these words, even I struggle, and my Georgia gets in there. So we're gonna keep that with HERDA.
HERDA.
HERDA. I've seen a handful of these, and it's truly a devastating disease. And I think the worst part is it shows up about 2 to 4 years old. So you've gone through all the work of producing this foal. You've kept this foal alive, which if anybody's ever bred horses, one of the most challenging things you'll ever do is keep a foal alive and intact, because it's, Lord, they love to get into things. So you've done all this work, and now you're finally getting to the fun part. We start getting ready to ride, and that's when this condition shows up. It causes extreme fragility of the skin. their collagen is very abnormal and it's very elastic. I mean, it's you grab the skin on these horses and you can almost stretch it. Like it's like really stretchy, and it almost looks like in the severe cases looks like it's trying to fall off of them. When these horses get injured, that's when we start to pick it up. They have abnormal wounds.
A lot of times it's the saddle. When they
Yes.
first start putting a saddle on, they take it off. They're like, "Whoa, what the heck is this?" And they've just got all these weird, wounds and open areas like on them. It's really strange.
Yeah.
And this is, this disease itself is autosomal recessive, which means that you have to have two copies of the non-dominant gene in order to express this.
Right.
So, this one I'd say is less common than some of our other diseases that we've talked about just because of this heritability, but it is something that I think you need to be cautious of, that, if your horse is a carrier of this recessive gene, they themselves aren't going to be showing symptoms, but you need to be really picky when you are looking for a horse to breed to, because if you breed to a horse that is also heterozygous for this and is carrying this, you have a 25% chance that your foal could have this.
Right.
And, playing the odds game, I don't want to take those odds.
And we're gonna get a graphic put up as well to go with this podcast that kind of goes through this to help people out, to understand how these genetic diseases, what your odds are of getting them, based on if they're heterozygous or homozygous, based on if it's a autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive. We're going to get a graphic up, so that'll help.
Yes,
That'll
absolutely.
help kind of understand we're going through these percentages. But you're right. Even if you've got two parents that are heterozygous, that's a 25% chance you can get this. That's a lot of risk.
A lot of risk.
A lot of risk. So again, autosomal recessive, you do have to have both. So good news, if you have one parent that is homozygous for is homozygous dominant, your risk is lower.
Right. And unfortunately, with a disease like this, we consider it fatal.
Most of these horses don't survive past 4 years old.
They don't.
That's a horse with HERDA 4 years old is a really old horse with HERDA.
Because you really can't ride them, because anytime you try to put any sort of tack on them, it basically just sloughs their skin off, and they're at a much higher risk too for just cutting themselves in the pasture. There's a lot of evidence too that this affects also the elasticity of vessels in their corneas. So even if they do, you wrap them in bubble wrap and their skin hasn't fallen off, there's evidence that they might fail elsewhere in the body.
Right.
So
yeah, so to me, this is one that you just don't take a risk with. Try to avoid at all costs. Thankfully, it is an autosomal recessive trait, so you do have to have both those copies. But just know, if you have a carrier, even if let's say the mare is a carrier and is heterozygous, but even if you're breeding to a homozygous dominant stallion, you still have a 25% chance you're going to produce a carrier.
right.
And now we have that gene carrying, and so this is something that, and the good thing is carriers won't show symptomatic signs, but you have to still be mindful you're passing this trait on.
Exactly.
You're passing it on. So,
Right.
or the ability to have this condition, you're still passing on. So, another cool one, when I was in school, this had a different name, but now it's called myosin heavy chain myopathy.
Yes.
We knew it when I was in school as immune-mediated myositis, but we're finding that is one of the things that can happen with it, two forms of it. With the myosin heavy chain myopathy, you can have two forms. One is the immune-mediated myositis. We'll talk a little bit about it. And the other one's a non-exertional rhabdomyolysis, meaning these horses cramp up without exercise. They
No
just
reason. Yeah,
cramp.
no obvious reason for this. So kind of similar presentations of it, but they found that there's kind of two variants of it. And this is a fun one, because this is what we go back to, the autosomal codominant, which means there are now two different sets of genes that are contributing to these signs. And they find too that the having one gene can cause the signs, and then sometimes it's that second gene that, makes them have a more dramatic of symptoms. And what's interesting about this one is that it's triggered by external factors, which is usually what sets off a lot of these signs. So the biggest one that we think of is strangles.
Yes.
That's kind of the one that comes to mind, is these horses that, come in contact with strangles, even a lot of times after they've recovered from it, they just lose all of their muscle mass.
I mean, and it's an overnight loss.
Yes.
And strangles is Streptococcus equi. Any strep species can cause this. And one of the things we know, like Streptococcus zooepididymis, or strep zoo as we call it, it's sort of a normal inhabitant. It sort of lives everywhere. And that can even lead to this. So any strep can lead to an immune-mediated myositis. Strangles is the one that's most common and probably produces the most severe clinical signs. And I've seen horses that have one of these strep situations, and you can look at them on Monday, and they look great. All of a sudden on Wednesday, you're like, my horse just lost 300 pounds, has no muscle tone. It's just gone. It is quick. And when I see that, I start to go back and say, okay, what's the history? And I said, well, he got sick about 2 weeks ago. And I was like, okay. He said, ran a fever, but he got over it in about 48, 72 hours. So, a lot of times I'm thinking then like a strep zoo issue. And then all of a sudden, boom, we have this massive immune-mediated myositis. We've lost all our muscle. And it's and this is a lifelong condition.
Yes.
Lifelong condition. We usually identify this when these horses are younger, but it's a lifelong condition. So anytime, like one of the big causes of cellulitis can be a strep species. So any kind of a strep infection can set you up. Vaccines can also trigger this. Vaccines.
Yeah. So again, this is one that isn't necessarily, devastating, but it's one that we have to navigate around. And
I like to call it frustrating.
Frustrating, yes.
Frustrating, because it never fails. Your horse is doing great. They're geared up. They're ready to go to a show. You get some weird, like they'll spike a temp for one day, goes down, and you come out and you're wondering where your horse went. And like I consider it a frustrating condition.
More frustrating, right?
So it's not life-threatening, but it is very frustrating. Like I said, especially with the non-exertional rhabdomyolysis form.
Oh yeah.
Because these horses cramp up, and now we're dealing with several weeks before they're able to get up and working again. And really the same thing for the IMM. You lose all that. Like you can lose muscle extremely fast, but putting it back on,
it doesn't come back fast.
Yeah. So again, this one I say is one, it is important from a breeding perspective, but it's more important from a management perspective. Like knowing your horse has this, have it tested, and that way and make sure your veterinarian knows if your horse is carrying this myosin heavy chain myopathy, because if it is, there's certain things we need to look at from a management perspective. We're going to have talks about vaccines. We're going to be prepared if we do have some type of an infection. We're going to be prepared for this, so we can be proactive about trying to minimize the symptoms. So it's more of a condition you want to know if your horse has it from
Right.
As far as management goes. Yeah, we got notes on this one if you're listening, because there's a lot.
There is a lot, yeah. We we tried to do this without notes previously, and we said we need notes for it.
Yeah, so that way, if you're sitting there going, "How am I going to remember all this?" Even veterinarians, we struggle to memorize all this. We still have to look things up.
We do
So,
all the time.
yes,
All the time.
Malignant hypothermia.
Yes.
All right, I thankfully have never seen this condition.
Better knock on some wood.
Yeah, I know, never seen it. And it's a malignant hypothermia. It's interesting because we found it because we were using halothane as an anesthetic. And for whatever reason, and luckily, I don't even think they make halothane anymore. I may be one of the last vets to remember halothane.
I think it was a slide in anesthesia that they're like, yeah, we used to use this.
Yeah, I've actually used it. I mean, it works great. Haven't had any issues, but you do always worry. All right, and it is more of a quarter horse condition, and in pigs, interesting
Yes,
enough.
they do. They have it in pigs as well.
But since we don't use halothane, it's not as big a concern. When we're using a lot of halothane, this was a routine test because you needed to know before you anesthetize them. Because what happens, they start inhaling the halothane as an anesthetic, and their temperature skyrockets. They go on the table with a temp of like 99.1 within 15 minutes. Their temp's like 106, 108, and it's complete. You cannot control it. I mean, the temp just skyrockets. Nothing you do is going to control this temp. It is it's a horrible like. There's enough stress when you're anesthetizing horses. I am so happy we don't use
That we don't do
halothane
this.
and we don't have to deal with this anymore. But
And it's interesting too, because they found that horses that carry this gene and they also carry the PSSM1 gene, they tend to have, more severe of PSSM1 symptoms.
Interesting.
Too. Yes. So there's a little bit of some co-dominance in there.
So I guess I'm having to change my way of thinking. If I have a horse that's positive for PSSM1, I need to be checking for malignant hypothermia.
Yeah, if it's because it can just cause their symptoms to be a little bit more dramatic.
Wow.
Yes.
Learned something today.
There you go. See?
Even in all my neuromuscular nerddom, I had not read that. So I guess because in my mind I was like, okay, halothane.
We're safe. We don't have to worry about that one anymore.
Yes, but it sounds like we do. But yeah, it's
Still around.
still around, but it's an autosomal dominant.
It is an autosomal dominant.
So you just need one. You need one allele, one gene. If you have that gene, you're positive. So if the mare is heterozygous and the stallion is homozygous,
you're gonna have your foal's gonna have it.
You're gonna end up. Yep. So let's avoid this one. Let's avoid it. But thankfully, we don't use halothane.
No.
However, now that we've learned that it can exacerbate PSSM, it makes you wonder, like, are these genes tied together somehow? Like, how?
It is interesting too, because because they're all linked back to the quarter horses, and I think maybe just because quarter horses are so prevalent here in the United States, and there's a lot of people that are in the quarter horse world, and a lot of these quarter horses are just doing a lot of different disciplines that maybe we just have the sheer numbers to say like, yeah, this is a quarter horse thing, but I don't really know.
Well, I think quarter horses have embraced genetic testing more than other breeds, which is a good thing.
Yes.
They really embrace the testing. And I've always said, too, when you look at quarter horse, there's no more variance within a breed than the quarter horse.
Yes.
You can have two quarter horses standing in here.
And they look completely different.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of variation. Everybody thinks quarter horses, little short, stocky horses.
Not at all.
But you've got others that look more thoroughbred. They're kind of we call them race bred.
Yeah, the race bred, and then you've got some of the bigger, pleasure bred guys. You've got the little barrel racers, little cutters.
Like, you look at a cutter and a race bred, and you're like, you're both the same breed. Yeah. I feel like you look at most warm bloods, they're kind of carbon copies.
Yeah.
You look at Arabs, they're very distinct. A lot of variation there, which makes sense why you can have a lot of genetic variation within that breed. And I think a lot of these genetic conditions we've developed over the years by selecting for certain phenotypes. A certain look or a certain ability, we have this phenotype, and without knowing, we were selecting for the genes for these conditions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Little segue there. That's what I love about this podcast. We just kind of go where it takes us. Let's talk about a little GBED, glycogen branching enzyme deficiency. This is different than PSSM. PSSM, they can store glycogen, they just can't utilize it. With GBED, they can't store glycogen, and glycogen is critical to life. Without glycogen, you have no energy stores.
Right.
And these horses, they just do not store energy.
No, these guys, they're born, they're severely weak. Most of them don't even end up standing, and if they do, they can't keep themselves up or nurse, and they usually end up dying pretty shortly after birth. So luckily this is another autosomal recessive.
Yes.
So they need 2 copies of that recessive gene in order to show this. So if the horse is heterozygous for it or a carrier, they're not going to show it, but they still have a risk of potentially passing this on, especially if you breed to another carrier.
Correct.
So luckily with this one, you'll never get to a point of seeing a horse reach adulthood and still have both copies of the recessive gene. It's not going to happen, but there are still carriers out there. So this is one that you want to be really, really careful when you are selecting a stud. If you know that your mare is a carrier of this, we probably want to be a little more picky.
If the stallion is heterozygous and the mare's heterozygous, you have a 25% chance you're going to produce an offspring
With
that has
this.
this condition. That's anybody that's been through the breeding process, all the work that it takes to get your mare bred, all the work it takes to carry this mare, only to have your foal survive. I mean, we're usually talking hours, maybe days.
Maybe a couple days at best. So
Let's be careful on this.
Yeah,
And again, this is one we can get rid of. We
Yeah.
can breed this out.
absolutely,
Let's
absolutely.
get rid of it. So
Right. So that's kind of summarizing the quarter horse diseases. And I know I really wanted to talk about too in this the Peruvian passos.
yes,
Because I think that's another one of these examples of, a breed industry really kind of cracking down and trying to do their part in
Right.
stopping this. So in this one, we're talking about DSLD, which is degenerative suspensory ligament disease, which we see in a lot of breeds.
right.
A lot of breeds.
A
It's
lot of
not.
breeds.
It's definitely not limited to the passos, but they found specifically in the Peruvian passos that there is a gene that basically increases their risk of developing this later in life. And this one is definitely more complex because that gene there doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have it, but they found that having that gene basically just increases their risk significantly for developing it. And so if you identify this gene early on, you can take a lot of measures earlier in life so that they're less likely to develop these symptoms.
Well, that's one of the things, if you go back to the beginning of the podcast that we talked about, is these horses may carry this gene, but we think there may be another gene that decides that codes for whether this gene's expressed or not, which leads to the complexity of genetic testing. And I want to be clear here, the gene has only been found in the Peruvian Pasifino.
Yes.
The other breeds, like the thoroughbreds, warm bloods, quarter horses, Arab saddlebreds that we see DSLD in, we have not identified a gene that leads to this.
Correct.
Only in the Peruvian Passos has this been found. And it's that's very important. And hopefully we do eventually find the gene in these other breeds so we can make some better decisions. Because I do feel like we're seeing more and more DSLD.
Yes.
I'm not sure if we just know what it looks like or if it's becoming more prevalent. Part of me thinks it's becoming more prevalent. And I think that's where we talk about we're selecting for a phenotype. Meaning we're selecting for a horse that looks a certain way and moves a certain way. Unfortunately, along with that is coming this heritability or this increase in DSLD.
Right, because I think there's again, like you've said, some of these diseases we haven't been able to find a single gene for it, but it's always interesting when you look at this horse and then you look at her dam, and her dam had the same disease, and then
Right.
you look at that horse's dam, and she had the same disease, and you keep going back and you're seeing a pattern.
Right.
You're like, I can't prove anything. However, this is more than just a coincidence at this point.
Exactly, because you like you said, when you go back and you look at 2 or 3 generations, or you have a mare that was retired because of this, and they decided to breed it. Because again, if you go back, we did the genes and heritability. It's a relatively new thing, and so some of these mares were bred, and all of a sudden their offspring has it, are showing these same signs, and so there's got to be some type of heritability we just haven't identified.
Right.
And especially if you look in the passos, this is complex, because even if you have the gene, you may need another gene that decides whether that gene's expressed or not. And so I think that's why we're really struggling to get to the genetic causes of this.
Exactly. And it's not to say that, just because, we had to retire your mare early because of an injury that we shouldn't breed her. That's not what we're saying at all.
Right.
But, I think it is something that, we do need to pay some more attention to, especially if we do have a good history on, where your horse came from and, their lineage, just kind of looking at, what previous injuries did we have in these, and is there a pattern to recognize?
Yes, because, and I can tell you, this is where when we know better, we do better.
Yes.
If we go back, like 8-10 years ago, if you had a horse that we suspected DSLD in, we weren't the best at identifying it. You know, we'd say like, her suspension's really dropped. She can't perform. We suspect DSLD. We'd go back and look, and like there may be no other horses in her line that had it. So we're like, well, maybe it's safe to breed these horses. Well, now that we're seeing like this isn't a great idea. DSLD suspected. We don't need to pass this on. But again, as we learn, and like I said, we could probably go back and redo this podcast. You know, hopefully we're still doing this podcast 10 years from now, and we're going to look back on this and say, wow, we really didn't know anything.
We didn't know anything, right.
And that's kind of the great thing about medicine. We're always learning, but the downside about medicine is what we think is true today may not be true 10 years from now.
Exactly.
So
especially in, you know, in a field like genetics where, you know, they're doing research all the time.
Every day. They're looking at new things that have come about, and I think, get a lot of information from, you know, from human medicine as well. That's where a lot of this kind of originally came from, and learning things and, you know, connecting dots. And a lot of times all it takes is, you know, just kind of one random finding. Right.
And they're like, oh, this is different.
Yes. Well, and if you look at Connemara's, that's one that's just come about here recently that we learned about.
Yes.
Connemara's have a condition called hoof wall separation disease. It is an autosomal recessive trait, so you do have to have 2 Connemara's to get this. So if you're crossbreeding, taking another breed and breeding it to a Connemara, it's not really a concern. But you can still produce a carrier. And Connemara is another association that's done a great job. If you're heterozygous or homozygous for this, it's noted. And I've got a couple of these I'm dealing with, and it's not a fun condition because the feet look great, and then it's literally what it says, hoof wall separation. The farrier comes out and feet have been looking great, goes to pull the shoes, and all the hoof wall's falling off. And you're like, oh crap, what do we do now? So
Yeah.
if you do have a full-blooded Connemara, this is something we need to check for. Everybody in Ireland, standard to check for this. It is on passports. It is on paperwork. If you have a Connemara, it's documented. We need to do that here as well.
Yeah. And it's you know, and like we said earlier, it's cool to see these breed associations that are, you know, taking initiative in this and trying to do, you know, the right thing. And, you know, and I hope that, you know, as we kind of discover more of these diseases, that the other breed associations, you know, kind of jump on that train too.
Yeah, we're seeing a big change. You know, there's, you know, at first with HYPP, it was a sweep it under the rug mentality, but we're going back to like I think the 60s on that, and so we're trying to sweep that under the rug. But now it's like, no, if we know better, we'll do better.
Yeah.
If we've got these conditions, let's do our part to minimize this, because I mean some of this is just not fair to the horse.
Right.
It's just not fair. So, you know, other things that I'm sure we're going to eventually find genetic links on navicular disease in quarter horses. There's been some speculation that recurrent obstructive airway disease or asthma is a heritable trait as well.
Yeah.
Equine metabolic syndrome
Absolutely.
can be heritable.
Absolutely.
We haven't identified this, but we're highly suspect of it.
Yes. And they've, again, just kind of looking at these patterns of, well, you know, this mare had it, and now her foal has it, and then the mare's dam also had it.
Yes.
And just, again, just kind of starting to connect dots and you know, paying attention and looking at things. So it's, you know, if you know your mare's history and, you know, where she came from, I think it's really, you know, important to go back and look and do your research and see what you can find.
Yep. So I think, you know, this has been a great podcast, and we did our best to cover briefly a lot of these genetic conditions. We promise we're going to come back and do some deep dives. Like I said, as we get into these, I mean, each one of these is almost their own separate podcast. So
Absolutely.
Look forward to those coming in the future, and we'll do a little bit deeper dive. We're going to get a graphic up on the website that kind of shows different heritabilities, how this comes out, percent chances. So, you know, if you're still confused, or I shouldn't say confused, but if you're still trying to wrap your brain around some of this. A picture's worth 1,000 words. We'll get that put up so you can take a look and kind of see where your risk factors are. So,
And we'll link to some of the websites that we use too for researching this, because I do think they're a really, really great resource. You know,
Really are.
if you are really interested in some of these, and there are a whole list of diseases too that we didn't even talk about,
Right.
that are on there as well. And you know, a lot of them are kind of breed specific. So if you are looking to breed a certain breed, they have them, but a lot of them too are just kind of generic. And if you have questions about, you know, hey, I'm looking to breed my mare, you know, what should I test for? We can definitely help you, you know, kind of pick and, you know, see what you need to look at. So,
yep, talk to your veterinarian. I can't encourage that enough. So, talk to your veterinarian, be responsible. I think that's really, really important.
yes, absolutely.
So, well, everybody, thank y'all for tuning in today. Hopefully, we didn't get off into the weeds too much. Like I said, our first attempt at this, we were an hour in, and we took some segues, so we had to redo this one. This is a giant retake. So,
Yes.
hopefully, this makes sense. If you got questions, shoot us an email, give us a call, send us a text. You can DM us. Carrier pigeons. Probably not Morse code. I don't know that we can do Morse code.
Yeah, I haven't learned that one
No,
yet.
I haven't either. So, but yeah, thanks for tuning in, Dr. Brown. Thanks for being here, and from Countryside Equine. We hope y'all are having a great week and have a great weekend. Y'all take care.